As Professor Pinsker mentioned, I am currently researching Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, the Russian author, in the context of the Russian populist movement of the late 1800s. Now, naturally, Tolstoy is most often perceived as the author of the great epic Russian novel War and Peace, Anna Karenina. However, as James Billington, a Russian cultural historian, has articulated, Tolstoy was such a formidable figure that he transcends the environment in which he lived, yet he was deeply rooted within it. Billington's point is very important because Tolstoy was not only this writer of these massive and influential works, but he was also a socially active individual. Most often in his later life, he's portrayed in peasant garb, working among the peasants, tilling the fields. However, earlier in his life, there is also this episode in the late 1850s and early 1860s where Tolstoy attempted to open peasant schools on his Yasnaya Polyana estate. And I focused on this briefly in my most recent paper submission. However, I'll go a little bit more in depth in it. At this time in Russia, the 50s through about the 1870s and 1880s, there was this phenomenon of a movement known as the Russian populist movement. Now, historically, we can view this in two separate ways. There's populism as a very focused movement of the 1870s, which was a series of very political or very violent movements, all very centralized, all very organized.
Hello. As Professor Pinsker already sort of mentioned, I'm doing research on Julia Morgan, Dickinson alumna, who is a medical missionary to China from 1922 to 1941. And she's best known to you all as the daughter of Dickinson President James Henry Morgan. But during her own time, she lived anywhere but in her father's shadow. Inspired by the progressive Christian movement for global missions, Morgan went to China and became a successful female doctor who translated cutting-edge standards of the medical profession into the Chinese practice of medicine. Our story begins in 1910 during Julia's junior year when she went with a delegation of Dickinson students to a convention for the Student Volunteer Movement for Foreign Missions in Rochester, New York. At the Rochester Convention, Julia Morgan heard speeches about the promise of the China mission field and would later explain this as the moment when she received the call to go to China as a medical missionary. Her decision to go to China sent her down a path of religious devotion, in which she ultimately found for herself secular success and personal fulfillment as a doctor, teacher, and researcher. Morgan entered the medical field at a paradoxical time in the United States.
My research this semester has focused on the relationship between expeditionary science and anthropology in 19th century America. Anthropology in this period was principally preoccupied with the question of where exactly American Indians came from and how they fit into existing European American narratives of the origin of humanity and the way in which human societies related to one another. In order to fit Indians into these narratives, anthropologists constructed elaborate systems of interpretation that could be used to slot Indians into biblical chronology, into systems of societal development where the Indians were necessarily at the bottom and Euro-Americans were at the top, racialized systems, etc. All of which effectively justified European American conquest of the Americas. This continuum was not, however, the only mechanism of anthropological study available in 19th century America. My research has looked primarily at an alternate model, that of the naturalist collecting expedition and the kind of anthropological work that was done by scholars and scientists who were not principally anthropologically minded and were not working with those theoretical systems that I just described in mind.
I began my research with the intention of studying several massacres which occurred during the American Revolution. As I did my research, I found my focus broadening to representations of British violence during the American Revolution. I decided to limit my focus to publications, specifically the Pennsylvania Gazette, and ask the following question: How did Pennsylvanians write about and interpret British actions during the American Revolution? The first thing I'm going to argue in my paper is I'm going to look at polemics and the issues associated with the disbursements of ideas from the paper. How did the articles articulate their vision of British actions during the war that convinced the colonists of their own moral superiority? Second issue I'm going to look at is the effect that these writings had upon nation building during the American Revolution. Whether intentionally or not, these writings had the effect of polarizing the colonists into two groups, either patriot or loyalist. The articles made it impossible for you to remain neutral during the war because of the language used to describe the British. As a colonist, you either had to accept the portrayals as true and become a patriot, or denounce them as false and become a loyalist. So I'm going to look at these documents as a product of the revolutionary period and how the words used to describe these events contributed to the creation of a national identity.